folks, welcome back. I'm Heather. So I've had a middling reading week, a little bit better than the previous week. The same distractions are in place, but I'm getting a little bit more progress on my reading, which is happy making, because the lack of reading meant that, like everybody else, and like probably you, I was spending too much time refreshing the news and refreshing Twitter and looking at epidemiological graphs and projections, all of those things in the world around us right now that we can't control. That's kind of the definition of an epidemic, I suppose, is that it's something that is not amenable to control, and that's a difficult thing to sit with. So I am happy this week that I've gotten a little bit more reading done. So one of the things I read this week is something that came up out of my reading for the project I'm working on, was Gillian Rose's Love's Work, A Reckoning with Life. And I didn't expect to read this, but I had a copy of it in PDF format. And I just sat down with it and worked through it in the course of one day. It's a short book. It's a collection of not entirely connected essays about her life, which she wrote, I think probably in 94, 95. It was published in 95, roughly around the time that she died. She died of ovarian cancer, which is one of those cancers that is usually not diagnosed until quite late in its progression. And they're interesting little essays. They're all autobiographical in some way. They're usually centered on her life or her relationship to a friend, and often a much older friend. So they're portraits of older women who are important to her, not her mother. Conversations around her father are included in the book, and it's an odd and quite compelling book that's kind of a combination of memoir and philosophy. I've found it quite a satisfying book to read, and I've reread parts of it already. It's 185 pages, so short and compact, and I think that's one of the reasons why it was easy for me to work through it. By work through it, I just mean read it. And it's felt really topical in a very indirect way. I mean, she's talking about love, the difficulties of love, the pleasures of love, what it means to be facing death. And it's a very indirect discussion of how she's facing death and how the people she's talking about are facing death. I'd highly recommend it if you can get your hands on a copy. If you can still get books delivered to you, or you can still pick them up, you might be able to find the recent reprint, the 2011-2012 New York Review of Books reprint. It's probably floating around, and I'm pretty sure you can find a PDF copy floating around on the web. You might not be familiar with Gillian Rose's name. I certainly wasn't. She's Jacqueline Rose, the literary biographer's sister, and she was a feminist, a sociologist, and a philosophy professor. It's made me want to read more of her work. The memoir itself is admirably free of most of the kinds of difficult language and vocabulary that you usually find in philosophically tinged works from the 1990s. It's a very unsentimental look at love and at death and love's work. The title of the book, I think, is actually a pun. I think it refers to both the things love can accomplish and how love is actually work, that you have to work at it. I'd highly recommend it if you're in the mood for a philosophical book that deals with feminist issues and illness. So another book that I'm partway through this week that I picked up that has been floating around on BookTube, I think, for quite a while, is Atul Gawande's Being Mortal. And like many of the other conversations I've seen about this book, I'd agree that it's well written and it tells a compelling story. I'm only about halfway through, which means I've read a fair chunk about nursing homes, and my mother died in a nursing home, so Gawande's comments are painfully familiar to me, and there's something very distinctive about nursing homes and the way they operate and the way they fail us. So it's not an easy read for me, but it's well written, it's clearly written, it's tackling important subjects, and I'm hoping to finish that this week. I didn't intend my week's reading to be so focused on death and dying, but that seems to be the way I've gone. I don't think I would have been able to read The Gawande around the time that it came out. It would have been far too close to the moment of my mother's dying for that. The other thing I read this week, I finished Deborah Levy's The Man Who Saw Everything. I didn't particularly enjoy this one as I was reading it. It's got a wildly unreliable narrator, Saul Adler, and I usually love a wildly unreliable narrator, but this one just didn't sit with me. I think partly because I couldn't connect with him, and partly I think it is something that the narrative is actually doing. It's a story that's very fragmented and odd in its structure. And it makes more sense once you finish the book. It's a short book, divided into two parts, when Saul is a young man and when Saul is an older man, and he's in a hospital after an accident. And I think what Levy's doing here is playing with memory and misremembering, and how we think about our youth and how we don't always remember ourselves and our actions accurately or fairly. So I think it's something that probably would repay rereading, but I'm not particularly motivated to reread it at this point. I think if you liked Ali Smith's How to Be Different, you might really enjoy the Levy book. And I think it would be an interesting exercise to read it in the Levy, to read it in a different kind of bind-up, in the way that the Smith book was presented in two different bind-ups, and people's reactions to Ali Smith's book, I think, varied depending on which account of the story they read first, whether they read the 16th century narrator's account first, or whether they read the contemporary 20th century narrator's account first. And I think Levy's book probably would be interesting to read back to front, as it were. So I'm not sure whether I'd recommend that one to anyone or not. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but I think that's more about me than about the quality of the writing. What else? I am hoping to read next week this. Lots of glare, sorry about that. This is Marie-Claire Bley's Mad Shadows. Now, I read this, first when I was 16 or 17. It would have been in one of my English classes when I was in high school. And I remember being fascinated by it and reading it a couple of times in my early 20s and my teen years. So I thought it would be interesting to reread it. It's the story of a very self-destructive family with some troubling interrelationships in the triangle of the mother and the two children. But that's basically all I remember about it. Marie-Claire Bley wrote it when she was quite a young woman. I think she was 20, 21 when it was published. So I'm looking forward to reading that this week. And it has the advantage of being another short one, in contrast to the Mirror and the Light, which I'm still making my way through. And every time I think about it in my head, I call it The Mirror and the Lamp, but it's not The Mirror and the Lamp, it's The Mirror and the Light. So I think that's what I'll tackle next. Sorry, I'm not going to weigh a stack of books. It's not really great for you. The things that I might tackle. So in addition to Mad Shadows, I think I will be tackling something like this, which is essentially a history book of education here in Nova Scotia. I need to read this one for a project I'm working on, and I've kind of been putting it off. But I'll probably dip into that one. The book that I've been dipping into and enjoying a great deal this last week is something that's essentially a reference book, and it's not intended to be read in one sitting, and I haven't read all of it. Of course, it's this, Books for Boys and Girls. This was assembled by Lillian Smith, who was one of the very earliest children's librarians in Canada. Probably not the first, but is generally thought of as the first. And this is a little reference book. So this one was published in 1940 and came out of the Toronto Boys and Girls Library. and has been reprinted multiple times in revised versions. You can find, I think, the 1918 version on Internet Archive. Print copies of this are on the scarce side. I think I've seen one offered for about $60 to $70 US. So if you see one in good shape, you might want to snag it if you're interested in library history. I'm sure you're all interested in library history. So I borrowed this from another library through interlibrary loan, and it arrived well before the shutdown of all the libraries here. And when I opened it up, I was surprised to discover that it's actually an association copy. I can associate this with a very specific person who was the woman who bought it and used it probably as part of her daily work, and that was Ella Smith. No relation to Lillian Smith as far as I can figure out. Ella Smith earned her doctorate in the early 1920s and worked as a journalist, giving lecture tours, traveled around Europe, and then ended up working in a variety of roles in a maritime university at Mount Allison. Underemployed, as many female academics of that period were, and she at one point was running the history department during the Second World War at Mount A. Was moved out of that role, as many women were moved out of their roles when the war ended, and she ended up opening and running a small bookstore at the university and being involved in various library-related things in and around Sackville. So I was just thoroughly delighted to discover that this was her book. I didn't expect that at all. And you can see, let's see if I can show you this. Maybe I'll got illustrations included and annotations. I'll see if I can pop a photograph in here. So when you go through it, this one's particularly great for me because it's got all the markings of a working book. That this is something someone used to make selections of books to add either to a bookshop or simultaneously a small library that I know was being maintained at Sackville at that period. So I'm really enjoying dipping into this. It divides children's books up into various types. It's like a standard library reference book. Provides, title, purchasing information, where you can buy it, what the likely cost is going to be, and short descriptions of the books. And this was published in 1940, so it captures essentially the reading world of Depression libraries in Canada. So I'm quite thrilled to actually have been making my way through that. I think that's all I have this week. I hope you are well. I hope the people around you are well. I hope that you are sitting as easily as you can with the difficulties that we're surrounded by. I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.